They say monarchs rule nations, but some truths dethrone them from within. It began not with a scandal in the press, nor a scandal shouted in chambers, but in something far quieter, the absence of trust, and the silence that follows its betrayal. Mist curled against the windows of Windsor that morning, ghosting over the frost-bitten lawns like a secret too heavy to speak aloud. Inside, the palace did what it always does, breathed in rhythms of ceremony, footsteps, and ancient routines, and yet behind one locked door, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The tick of an antique clock echoed against paneled walls, slower than usual it seemed, louder, almost watchful. A drawer opened, fingers paused, something that should have been there, wasn't. It was not gold, not jewels, not even power in its traditional sense, but something more sacred to the monarchy. Integrity, perhaps, or the quiet contract between duty and restraint. Whatever had been taken, it was not merely stolen. It was stripped from within the skin of the institution itself. And the one who found it was not a monarch, but the woman married to its heir. Not a queen yet, but something just as consequential, a witness with the will to speak. Princess Catherine had always been a figure of grace, polished, poised, dutiful to the code of silence. But that morning she did not call an aide. She did not raise her voice. She simply closed the drawer, stood a little straighter, and walked out as if carrying centuries on her shoulders. There was no shouting, no broken glass, only the soft closing of a door, and the echo of footsteps retreating down a hallway once lit by kings. That evening, a crest was removed from a study door. No ceremony, no announcement, just a quiet act, done by hand, not decree, as though history itself had been told to stand down. In the days to follow, nothing would ever be the same. But in that moment, only the mist knew what had just begun. A betrayal too devastating for the crown to ignore, and too dignified to shout. Evening fell over Windsor as the Queen's portrait watched from the wall, unmoving, unblinking. Outside, the chill of late winter crept across the castle's stone facade, glazing the windows with breathy frost. Inside, silence settled between the tapestries and mahogany panels like an old servant, familiar and unseen. Windsor, ever timeless, seemed to hum with invisible rules, the kind passed down, never written, always obeyed. The room was unremarkable in its decor, a modest study tucked near the private wing, but it bore the scent of legacy, parchment, wood smoke, the faint echo of voices that once shaped nations. It was here, under the fading light of a leaded glass window, that Princess Catherine entered alone. No entourage, no warning, just a single woman with eyes trained by years of observation, and a stillness that often said more than speeches. She had not come looking for anything, but royalty lives inside a clockwork of patterns, and she knew this one was off. A stack of papers had shifted. A file that should have been sealed bore a fold, as if recently handled, and beneath it something else, a slim folder, unlabeled but heavy with weight far beyond paper. She opened it, slowly, like unwrapping something sacred or forbidden. Inside, records, financial transfers, an interweaving of familiar ones, tied to funds meant for public good, a charity under royal patronage, a trust connected to her children's future. But more than that, fingerprints of intention, the suggestion, no, the pattern, of quiet diversion. Sums moved, causes left short, and a signature that needed no decoding. It was the king's hand, Charles himself. Catherine did not gasp, did not weep. There was only the stillness of realization, the kind that does not rise like a flame but settles like frost. Her fingers released the folder. She closed the drawer with deliberate care, as though returning a relic to a tomb. Then she stood, a pause. She looked around the room as though seeing it not for the first time, but for the last. The walls lined with heritage, the portraits of sovereigns who had worn both crowns and blindfolds. And there, watching her from above the mantel, the Queen, Elizabeth, grandmother-in-law, matriarch, her painted gaze eternal, unblinking. That night, Catherine walked alone through the inner garden paths, the cold threading through the trees like questions in a cathedral. She did not wear a coat, only a shawl. Perhaps the chill kept her sharp. Perhaps she needed to feel something real in the night air. She met with someone trusted, discreet, a royal advisor whose name would never appear in the press, but whose counsel had shaped decades. They spoke for nearly an hour under the arch of a bare trellis, as the castle behind them glowed like a relic too old to forget its own ghosts. She asked one question, then she asked for one thing. A meeting, privately, unrecorded, No titles, no robes, just truth. And that's when the shift began. Invisible, but irreversible. Word passed quietly. Doors were unlocked and relocked. Schedules changed without public notice. The palace, always careful, began to breathe faster. By morning, servants would be told His Majesty was indisposed. A state document would be delayed without reason. Camilla would cancel a quiet lunch. And deep within Windsor's walls, a confrontation would be prepared. Not of fury, but of reckoning, because Catherine had found something that didn't belong to her, and still somehow had always been hers to protect. Not money, not land, but the moral spine of a family who had ruled too long without ever asking who watched the watchers. And for the first time in decades, the room had changed, not because someone had spoken too loudly, but because someone had finally refused to stay silent. A footman noticed the locked door. A valet saw the tears on linen, but no one said a word. There are moments in royal life when silence isn't merely etiquette, it is armor. That week, Windsor Castle did not erupt. It recoiled. Behind the heavy oak doors and beneath oil paintings of kings past, there was no shouting, but something had broken. And in the breaking, everyone heard it, though none dared name it aloud. A senior aide, speaking only through trusted intermediaries, later described the mood as ice underfoot. Tension gripped the palace like frost clinging to old stone, invisible but everywhere. In the hours after Catherine's midnight meeting, small changes rippled through corridors known for their unchanging nature. A portrait of King Charles, recently added to a south corridor, was quietly removed. A ceremonial coat of arms, usually placed before state meetings, vanished from the Prince and Princess of Wales's private wing. Staff noticed. Of course they did. They always do. One valet reportedly found a handkerchief, monogrammed, stained with tears, folded with an unnatural care atop a silk coverlet. Whose it was, no one said, but everyone knew. The whispers began in corners. Not gossip, but a kind of reverent decoding. This wasn't a scandal born of indiscretion. This was legacy, unraveling itself. Some within the household scrambled to control the bleeding. Loyalists to the king, men and women who had served him since the duchy days, moved swiftly. Conversations were monitored. Access lists were revised. A memo was drafted under the heading, "Maintain dignity, reaffirm stability." But for others, those younger, quieter, often overlooked, the moment felt like vindication, a silent reckoning. As one housekeeper reportedly murmured while polishing a candlestick, she finally did what no one else dared. Within the family itself, the reactions were measured, but telling. Camilla was silent. Her schedule suddenly emptied. She did not attend her usual morning briefings. For 2 days, her personal secretary deflected all inquiries with a single phrase: "Her Majesty is unavailable." William, on the other hand, was seen in the king's private study, not once, but twice. On both occasions, he left without a word to staff, jaw tight, eyes forward. But it was the third sighting that said the most. He emerged from his wife's room later that night, without his wedding ring. None of these things appeared in tabloids. They weren't meant to. But the palace itself, that ancient, breathing organism, has a memory longer than any servant. It knows the weight of secrets. It remembers tears cried behind brocade drapes. It whispers across the centuries, not in headlines, but in shifted furniture, changed menus, rearranged seating. It has happened before, one footman was overheard saying near the service stairs. Different names, same ghosts. Indeed, the monarchy had survived abdications, divorce, wars, and betrayals. But the most dangerous wounds were never inflicted by enemies, only by family. And now, as the halls grew colder and the portraits watched on, it was clear the institution had heard what had been discovered, and it was already choosing how to forget. He once said, "I was born into gold, but I dreamt in gray." Before he was king, he was Charles, a boy who wandered palace gardens with poetry books tucked beneath his arm, who sketched watercolors by the loch while others practiced salutes. He had always been different, sensitive, perceptive, a prince with the soul of a historian and the heart of a gardener. And yet, the throne doesn't wait for soft hearts. It molds them. Now, years later, seated alone in a study once lined with his mother's correspondence, King Charles faced not a foreign adversary or a political revolt, but something far more disarming: the quiet, unwavering judgment of a new generation and the woman his son married. He hadn't meant to deceive, or so he told himself. The documents, the ones Catherine found, weren't misused, not in his eyes. They were redirected, repurposed, a portion of charitable funds placed into initiatives he believed Parliament wouldn't prioritize. architectural restoration, environmental stewardship, preserving history not for glory, but for continuity. But he did it quietly, without transparency, without discussion, and perhaps without permission, because he knew that the crown, like the people it represents, was growing younger, hungrier for integrity, and less forgiving of the old ways of cloaked discretion. Still, he could feel the ghost of his mother in the room, not in voice but in presence. Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned through wars and scandals, who never once raised her voice, but whose silences could split oceans. He had lived in her shadow for 70 years. Now he lived beneath her judgment. The crown is heavier in silence than it is in ceremony, he once wrote in a private journal during his 50s, a line later discovered by royal biographers but never publicly discussed. In this moment, this reckoning, was that silence returning to him like a toll unpaid. He did not blame Catherine. How could he? She had always walked with integrity. What she uncovered was not a betrayal of him, but of trust, the very foundation of monarchy. And in that sense, she had done what he himself had once longed to do, confront the unspoken. But there was pain too, a soft, unshowable grief. He remembered being a boy, watching his mother from the upper balcony as she returned from a tour abroad, waving to strangers who would one day demand answers from him. He remembered her saying once, "You do not inherit a crown, Charles. You borrow it from those not yet born." Now those unborn voices were arriving, not in revolt, but in quiet correction. And so he sat, not as king, not as father, but as a man staring down the limits of legacy. A monarch not defeated by scandal, but by the dawning realization that nobility without scrutiny is no longer enough. Outside, the evening bells tolled, not for death, not yet, but for a reckoning. When he stepped out that morning, the brooch on his lapel was gone, and so was something in his eyes. The occasion was ordinary, even hopeful. An opening ceremony for a new public library in East London, a cause King Charles had long championed. Literacy, heritage, education, the pillars of a nation's future. It should have been a celebration. It was in form. But the moment the black vehicle pulled up to the curb and the car door opened, something felt off. The king stepped out first. His usual navy suit was immaculate, his smile practiced. But on his lapel, where the Prince of Wales' feathered brooch had once been a fixture, there was nothing, no insignia, no decoration, just a flat field of blue wool, like a missing emblem or a lost shield. Moments later, Catherine emerged, poised, gloved, composed in the way only a royal can be when carrying a truth too heavy for words. Her posture was impeccable, chin slightly lifted, every step considered. And yet, what caught the eyes of seasoned watchers and quietly shook the press corps was the dress, pale blue, high-collared, clean lines, a modern cut with vintage soul. It was the same dress Diana had worn in 1992 to a charity gala, the year the palace confirmed her separation from Charles. No statement was made, none needed to be. Between them, no hands were exchanged, no shared glances. They moved like two planets, long caught in the same orbit, but no longer warming each other's skies. The press, bound by decorum, reported the visit in expected tones, a warm reception, a continued commitment to public service. His Majesty and the Princess of Wales attend literacy event. But the photographs, they said more than the headlines ever dared. One showed Charles turning toward the crowd, mid-wave, his expression caught between presence and absence. Another froze the moment Catherine looked away from him, not in defiance, but with a grace that no longer needed proximity to speak power. Behind them, the plaque they unveiled bore both their names, but viewers noticed the order: the Princess of Wales and His Majesty the King. A small thing, or perhaps everything. Public life continued, as it always does. The monarchy cannot afford pause. But those with trained eyes saw a subtle rearranging of shadows, not in statements, but in spacing, not in declarations, but in the dignity of silence. Later that evening, tabloids tried to stir something. Tension at the palace? No touches, no smiles. Is all well between king and future queen? But seasoned columnists, the ones who had watched the House of Windsor long before hashtags and headlines, wrote only this: the princess did not speak. She didn't need to. That was the power of the crown. And now it seemed the power of Catherine. She hadn't broken a vow. She had held it to the light. She hadn't demanded a change. She had become the reason for one. And in the space between their hands, the absence of gesture, the cold blue fabric, the bare lapel, the country saw what even the loudest voices couldn't deny. The monarchy had shifted, quietly. decisively. Not through force, but through grace that would not blink. It was not the first time trust had been misplaced inside palace walls. The story unfolding in the present was not born of the present. It was an echo, a pattern, centuries in the making, a pattern of silence, of discretion weaponized, of truths tidied away beneath tapestries and royal seals. In 1936, it was Edward VIII, the king who abdicated not just for love, but to protect the royal family from a brewing political embarrassment. Long before his departure, questions surrounded his financial entanglements. Private gifts, offshore holdings, dealings with unsavory powers. The monarchy, in response, sealed the archives and carried on. Decades later, the Duchy of Cornwall, the very estate Charles once managed as prince, would come under quiet scrutiny. Questions were raised about opaque investments, shell companies, and profits moved just beyond the reach of public accounting. The king's defenders called it tradition. Critics called it insulation. Either way, the institution did what it always had: protect the image, even if the truth cracked beneath. And now in the present, with Catherine's discovery, with silence unfolding in corridors once ruled by iron courtesy, the past was breathing again. Every monarch fears being remembered not for what they gave, but what they kept. Charles had always carried a complicated relationship with public trust. As a younger man, he was seen as progressive, a prince who spoke to trees, who fought for endangered buildings, who wrote letters to ministers and dreamed of harmony between man and nature. But with age came caution, secrecy, a need to preserve, perhaps, what felt too fragile to explain. He had watched the world change too fast, and somewhere between principle and power, he learned to hold things tighter, to move carefully, to act sometimes without asking. And now that very instinct, meant to protect legacy, threatened to unravel it. Because in the House of Windsor, history is not just what is remembered, it is what repeats when no one is brave enough to name it. No crown is heavier than the one held in shame. The confrontation did not take place in the halls of Westminster, nor beneath the vaulted ceilings of Buckingham. It was not televised, and no press secretary was briefed. It happened behind closed door at Sandringham House, the royal retreat in Norfolk, a place meant for rest, reflection, and as history has often revealed, reckoning. A bitter coastal wind swept through the fields that morning. The bare branches outside tapped gently against the windows, like history itself asking to be let in. Within the drawing room, fire lit, curtains drawn, the royal family gathered. Not all of them, only the necessary few. Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, and two senior advisors, standing at a distance as if to witness but not interfere. No cameras, no pens, just breath and silence. Charles sat near the hearth, not as king but as father, husband, and now figurehead under inquiry. His expression was calm, almost tired, though behind his eyes something flickered. Not fear, but the ache of being found out. Across from him, Catherine stood. She did not tremble. She did not raise her voice. She wore navy, modest, resolute, with a small sapphire pin at her collar. It caught the firelight, just barely. Her words came not as attack, but as invocation. "This ends now," she said softly, "or history will write it for us. No accusation, no demands, only clarity." William, seated beside her, did not speak immediately, but when he did, it was not as husband nor son, but heir. His voice was firmer than his father's, his sentence shorter. "We can't lead like this. Not anymore." The room fell still. The fire crackled behind Charles, casting flickering shadows against the portraits of his ancestors. Kings who had lost empires, broken unions, and made enemies of their own blood. Camilla's eyes narrowed. She had watched her husband rise through decades of misunderstanding, survive scandal, endure public scrutiny. Now to see him cornered, not by tabloids, but by his own family, was too much. Her voice, when it came, was hushed but sharp. "He gave his life to this. You forget what that costs." But the key, Catherine implied with silence, was now being paid by the institution itself. The proposal was not abdication. That would shake the realm. It was quieter, more symbolic, but no less severe. Charles would step away from Windsor, his ancestral home, his seat of memory. He would reside privately, elsewhere, appear only as needed, no longer at the center, not erased, but eclipsed. It was called a symbolic retreat, but everyone in that room knew what it meant: eviction, of authority, of trust, of presence. The decision broke no law, defied no constitution, but it redrew the map of royal power, not by removing a monarch, but by repositioning him. Palace aides called in shortly after, attempted to contain the narrative. The king will be resting, one memo read. A transitional phase, another noted. Euphemisms mounted like sandbags against a rising tide. But inside the palace, where the scent of burnt wood mingled with legacy, the truth was known. A line had been drawn, not in rage but in resolve. And Catherine, with no crown, no title beyond what was given, had stepped into the space where monarchs had long feared to stand, the place where silence is broken. She did not do it for herself. She did not do it to Charles. She did it for the crown, the one her children will one day carry, and that she had quietly sworn to protect. And so the crest above the palace gate was not replaced, only dimmed. There was no formal announcement, no midnight press conference, no sudden abdication or declaration from the balcony. The change came like most things royal, slowly, politely, and yet unmistakably. King Charles was no longer residing at Windsor. The official statement was brief. His Majesty will be spending extended time at Clarence House, attending to personal matters in private reflection. A follow-up cited rest, wellness, a period of retreat, long overdue. But the absence, it roared. For decades, Windsor had been his second skin, the place he returned to after every tour, every speech, every storm. And now its windows stayed dark, its halls silent. Courtiers adjusted quietly. The royal standard no longer flew above its battlements. Portraits of Charles were moved from central placement to side galleries. In the public dining room, his chair remained, but unoccupied, always polished, never touched. In his place, Catherine stepped forward, not abruptly, but with a precision that could only be learned by watching the throne long enough to understand its weight. Her first engagement after the shift was deliberate, a royal forum on financial transparency, hosted at a university in Bristol. No tiara, no escort, just her, at a podium speaking in the firm, clear voice of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to protect. Accountability, she said, is not a disruption of tradition. It is what ensures its survival. The press responded with care, caution wrapped in admiration. The princess leads with grace, one headline read. A future queen in all but name, whispered another. But the symbolism spoke louder than the sentences. In the annual Christmas photo, Charles was notably absent. The released image, framed in soft gold, showed William, Catherine, and their children on the palace steps. The sun behind them, the future ahead. New seating charts were leaked from a Commonwealth banquet. Catherine placed beside a prime minister. William seated center, where his father would once preside. And while the palace declined to comment on operational dynamics, one couldn't help but notice that every speech, every engagement, every carefully posed photograph pointed toward continuity without Charles. Camilla too receded, fewer public appearances. A statement released from her office simply read, "Her Majesty supports the crown's ongoing evolution." Behind palace gates, aides moved quietly. Charles' name remained in formal documents, but fewer events bore his signature. His weekly audiences with the Prime Minister were said to continue, but by phone, and always in private. No one said the word, no one dared, but the people did. Queen Catherine, first in whispers, then in columns, then, without irony, in public speeches by community leaders, fundraisers, school children, presenting flowers. Not as a correction, but as a foretelling. The monarchy had not fractured, it had refocused. And Catherine, once consort in waiting, now moved with the quiet command of someone no longer waiting for permission to lead. They said nothing, and in doing so, rewrote everything. Seasons passed, as they always do. At Windsor, the ivy crept slower across the stone, as if mourning something it could not name. The great clock in the West Tower continued to chime, though some days it felt more like memory than music. The palace gates still open for visiting dignitaries. Horses still trotted across the gravel courts. But the rhythm was quieter now, steadier, as though the institution, having exhaled a centuries-old truth, was learning to breathe again. In one scene, a child's laughter echoes through the royal gardens. The next generation, unaware of the burden they would one day carry, plays in the shadow of a tree planted by Queen Victoria. In another, a crown rests beneath glass, displayed in an exhibition titled The Weight of Legacy. Visitors pause to read the plaque beside it, not just about monarchs past, but about the quiet transformation led by one who never wore it. And then Charles. He walks slowly through a private garden on the edge of the estate. No guards, no audience. Just an aging man in a wool coat, pausing to look at the roses, the ones he planted himself long ago. His face carries no bitterness, only reflection. A life lived in service, in shadow, not dethroned, not shamed, but moved aside like a stone in a river, still present, but no longer altering the current. Finally, Catherine. A camera captures her in profile. Then slowly she turns, not toward a crowd, not toward applause, but directly into the lens, into history. She says nothing. She doesn't need to. There is something in her gaze, not defiance, but dignity. A message passed without words. This will never happen again. The monarchy endures, as it always has, but it is no longer untouched. It is no longer sealed in marble. It has been questioned, corrected, and changed. Not by revolution, not by scandal, but by something far more lasting. In a palace of centuries, it was not war that moved the walls. It was a whisper.